And first of all, I want to welcome you here, and let the guys know a little bit about you. So, Professor Benjamin J. Noonan is a professor, an associate professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Columbia International University. You did your PhD in Hebrew Union College, and your bachelor in Wheaton, and you actually majored in physics or something, right?
I
And that is
did. It was quite
right.
the switch.
Right. I think Professor Michael Siegel, whom we had here in the past, majored his bachelor in math. So it's interesting to see, this kind of scholars who have also background in the science, not just in the humanities. It makes for good scholars. They have good judgment. And he's a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, ETS, the Society of Biblical Literature, the Institute for Biblical Research, and the National Association of Professors of Hebrew, American National, I should say, right? Um, and he is our honored guest. We will talk about his book, Non Semitic Loanwords in the Hebrew Bible. And is there anything I neglected to say about you, Professor Noonan?
No, I think that's pretty good. You introduced me very well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. And since we're talking about non-Semitic loanwords, what are loanwords, I should say? What is a loanword, maybe?
So a loan word is a word that's been, we say, borrowed from another language, um, adopted from another language. Obviously, you can't borrow something and then not give it back. Once a word enters a language, then it stays there. So the terminology is a little confusing perhaps, but it's a word that comes from another language that has been adopted by a particular language. And so at least in English, good examples of words like this would be something like sushi or salsa. Often words are borrowed along with the thing that they represent. And so people don't have a word to represent it. And so they adopt the thing, they like it. People like salsa or sushi, but they need some way to refer to it. And so they adopt the word along with it too.
Right. First of all, you already had me, with the examples, the food examples in the book. You had chocolate, which is
Uh-huh.
also a great example.
Yes.
And I always, refer to chocolate when I talk with my students about roots and patterns. I talk to them. I say I'm a chocolatier. We have a mold. We have different types of chocolate, and we're making pralines. So that's you bought me there when you had the chocolate as an example of a loan word.
Uh-huh.
Um, and what are different types of loanwords? Because it's not all one size fits all. We have different types, and you write about it. One of the things that I love about your book, and I recommend everybody to go get it, and I sent everybody the link to the Amazon page with your various books, is the fact that you go both very much into detail. It is a lexicon at the end of the day of essentially all non-Semitic loan words, which are not proper nouns and are not, with some caveats there, but it's a lexicon, but it's also dealing with the major questions. And I loved it. And so I want to go through these general questions as well as see some of the examples. So what are the different important types of loan words that anyone interacting with a Hebrew Bible should consider?
Well, there's a few different categories, I guess we could say, of loan words. So my book deals with what are called non-Semitic ones. So coming from languages that are outside the Semitic language family. So we're talking things like Egyptian, Persian, Hittite. Those would be different kinds of loan words than Semitic loan words, which come from languages like Aramaic or Arabic or Akkadian. And people have studied those. There haven't been quite as many studies, or at least not in recent years, on the non-Semitic ones. So that's,
Sure. I should say that even to go even further with what you say, the history of the Semitic loan words within the Hebrew Bible goes back to medieval Jewish grammarians such as Ibn Janach and others which you mentioned as well. And they had a very interesting situation in which they were kind of a triglossia of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, and that created a very good background for having a touch, a feel for these loanwords, but not as much with the non-Semitic languages.
Mhm.
So, yeah, you've mentioned the non-Semitic loanwords and versus Semitic loanwords, but within the categories of loanwords, what are the major different type of loanwords that we may have when we see the Hebrew Bible?
Well, so we have ones that are borrowed directly from another language. So maybe, say, for example, well, a good one in biblical Hebrew would be the word for Pharaoh that we translate as Pharaoh or Paro, is not a native Hebrew word, comes from Egyptian and probably borrowed directly from Egyptian. So that would be an example of what we call a direct loan word. But we also have words that were borrowed through a Semitic language from a non-Semitic source. And a great example of this in Hebrew would be a word like word for temple or palace, which comes through Akkadian, but ultimately comes from Sumerian.
Right,
So
we were talking about it. We kind of sometimes talk about the history of the Hebrew language, and we've talked about the Heichal and the Shegal, and even we got even into the Tar Lugal. So people know that it is the bird of the big man now, right? Which is a good example, as you said, for a transmitted loanword. So great minds, I would say. I hope. Very good. So as far as the history of the loanwords, we've talked about transmitted and non-transmitted words, like direct loanwords. And what is the significance of identifying these loanwords, especially the non-Semitic, in order to understand the Hebrew Bible and the context of the Hebrew Bible?
Well, the significance was really the thing that got me into this in the first place. I've always been interested in words and lexicography and the study of words and that kind of thing. But the thing that's really interesting to me about loanwords is that they very often reflect some kind of contact between people groups. And so if a word's being borrowed from one group to another, it means that those people are in contact somehow. It could be what we call intensive contact, where there's lots of contact between them. It could be more casual, more sporadic, but either way, there's going to be contact between them. And so loanwords have a lot to say just historically about the connections between people groups, which is a really interesting thing. And in addition to that, we can also talk.
I just wanted to kind of invoke a very interesting scholar, Jewish American scholar, by the first Jewish American Bible scholar, I should say, American born, Cyrus Herzl Gordon, who dealt with some of these issues with Homer in the Bible and other. He was a very kind of sometimes free-spirited scholar, very, very, he had great ingenuity in many of his writings, at least, I feel that way. And I actually got to study at the Hebrew University with his son's Hebrew teacher or something like that. She told stories about it. Yeah, but that's anyway, so he wrote about connections between Israel and the Greek world in the pre-Hellenistic era, which again is much reminded me what you said about the interaction between people. Definitely took me there.
Yeah, there's a lot that can be said as far as these kinds of historical contacts, and the interesting thing is that it's in all different places. I mean, you mentioned the Aegean, there's Egypt, there's Mesopotamia, if we're thinking like Persian loanwords, and so there are loanwords coming from all different regions and different, I guess we could say, categories or like types of loanwords for different things. So maybe words from Persia, there's going to be a lot that have to do with like economics or administration or that kind of thing. Whereas in Egypt, we have some of those, but then there might be a lot of words connected with writing. That there's a number of loan words connected with writing that come from Egypt. So different regions have different features and just different patterns that we can observe there, which is a pretty neat thing.
Sure. Yeah. Based on the interaction, let me kind of, when I talk about the destruction of the first temple being the watershed line of kind of the division between standard biblical Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew, I sometimes talk about the fact that all of my grandparents spoke Hungarian and I only know the name of the foods. I don't know anything. So in a sense, it depends really, as you said, about the type of interaction, because the type of interaction that I had with Hungarian culture is through my grandmother's kitchen. And so the loan words, so to speak, or the, I don't know if that's the exact correct terminology in this case, but the influence of Hungarian language on my own idiolect is concentrated in the kitchen, so to speak. And in a similar sense, as you said, the Persian interaction with the Hebrews was centered around administrative and economical relationship, especially in the Persian period, then we are more likely to see words related to that, such as Gizbar and others. Okay, so we talked a little bit about Egyptian examples. We visited Persia a little bit. What are your favorite kind of loan words that are surprising to the listeners, or that are unique, or that are not what you thought when you began this course, or not what other schools? What are the gems, so to speak, if some of the gems are indeed loan words? Many of the gems are loan words, but what are the linguistic gems that you like from different languages in the biblical Hebrew?
Well, I can talk about some of the loan words that are connected with gems or precious stones. Those were some of the really interesting ones for me, and I think there's a few different ones. But what's interesting is we take a look at a word like pitta, which shows up with reference to the high priest breastplate, but then also
right.
Yeah, shows up there, and a lot of people had, previous to my book and my research, a lot of people had suggested that this word comes from India, or just someplace off in the east. And so we actually have a number of words that people have identified as coming from like the Indic languages. Now, the interesting thing about that is, well, there's a few things. First of all, at least in the book of Job, it associates this word with the region of Cush. And so kind of that area connected with Egypt. And when we take a look at the word, there's another interesting thing there. As far as the form of it, it begins with, it has a really unusual morphology, just because it's got like the dalet and the tet together. So that's
right, two dental, successive dental consonants, right?
Exactly. So that's unusual. But then we look at the beginning of the word, and we see that it has a pei with a hirik, and it's not necessarily a normal way, not that it's super unusual, but it's not a normal way to start a Hebrew word. That is a particular letter and vowel that you would find in words borrowed from Egyptian.
Right,
Pinchas represents the article, the Egyptian article.
Right, so we have even, in proper names, Pinchas as a good example, for instance, for the P at the beginning. So Piteda, also Achlama, comes Achlama, I should say. The accent is penultimate, surprisingly there. Maybe also related to the fact that it is not so much Semitic originally. Also, if we're already talking about precious materials, funny enough, sometimes we see the Egyptian integrated with a Hebrew word in an example that is beautiful, which you cited in your book, which is shen hav or shen habim. The word shen hav. I have a funny story. One of my professors at the Hebrew University, they had his kindergarten. Every child had to bring to the kindergarten an item in the successive letter, and they had. He wanted to bring his stuffed elephant, but he didn't get the word the letter pei. He got the letter hey. So his father said, "Don't worry, you can bring it. Tell the kindergarten teacher that hav is the word for elephant," right? Because shen hav is an integration of a foreign Egyptian word hav, and the shen, the tooth. So the ivory, okay, which is the tooth or the tusk of the elephant, becomes shen hav, combining a loan word with a Hebrew word. Beautiful, beautiful example. As I said, I wholeheartedly recommend looking at these interesting examples. So there are some languages that are less known among readers of the Bible that have affected the Bible. So people know about Egyptian because of the context of the story of the Exodus, and definitely the Persian because of the Persian period and Cyrus and so forth. But there are languages that are less known, such as Hurrian and others. What are the contribution of these less known languages to the biblical Hebrew, or some of the examples?
There's not as many words that come from Hurrian or Hittite, but when they do appear, they tend to show up in certain places. So there's a number of words which are connected with like weaponry or the military. So let's see, like a word like it's kidon, which is used with reference to Goliath and his armaments. So that is a word which it seems, and for some of these we're not quite as sure always, but it seems that we can connect it with Hurrian. And also some of the other terms, like some terms related to his armor, his helmet.
Oh, that's an excellent word to discuss in the linguistic context. The word kova, right?
Mm-hmm.
The word kova is interesting because, sorry for interrupting, as you write, it appears twice. Once with a kaf, and once with a kof.
Mm-hmm.
So the unusual, inconsistent spelling can teach us about the history of the Hebrew, or first of all, suggest that it is not originally a Hebrew or a Semitic word, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the thing that's going on here is that the people hear this word, and there's some question as to, okay, what's the best way to pronounce this in Hebrew? And we could pronounce it with a kaf, we could pronounce it with a kuf. Either way is an approximate rendition, just because there's no, perfect correspondence with that Hurrian sound there.
Right. It's like when you have to kind of transcribe, not transliterate Hebrew words to English-speaking audience. So you might use a ch for a chet, or an h for a chet if it's not a transliteration but a transcription. Anyway, it's not exactly there. Okay, it's an approximation. So either you write kova with a kaf or with a kuf. It is not exact. It's not a Semitic word, and the two alternative spelling, as you've mentioned, suggest that the origin of it is not Semitic. What other interesting loan words can help us better understand the historical development of Hebrew? Because sometimes, and we see it, like I think most intuitively with the Septuagint, people take transcribed Hebrew words and say, oh, based on the fact that the Septuagint transcribes a certain Hebrew word in a certain way, I can learn about the history of the Hebrew. Or they do it with the Alamana letters. The fact that we see this Canaanite word written in Akkadian in such a fashion, that can tell us something about the history of the development of the Hebrew. I want to go with you the other way around. What can we learn about the Hebrew based on the loan words that we find in the Hebrew Bible.
So what can we learn about like the Hebrew language from the loan words?
Right, the development of the Hebrew, the fact that they chose the kuf or the kaf suggests, let's say, there are no traditions about the Hebrew. It would suggest that the kuf and the kaf share something in common. Okay, now if the kaf was radically pronounced in a kind of a always fricative way, let's say, it would definitely share less commonality with the kof. So we can, based on the two, as you brought this example from Hurrian, talk about the similarity between the two. What other contribution do loanwords have on the understanding of the historical development of the Hebrew?
Well, I think so. We do see a number of words where there's different spellings there, and it may be possible in some instances to assign like one spelling to an earlier date for the text, and then others for a later date. So there are examples of that. One of the interesting things that I look at in the end, and maybe this is more the other way around. I don't know if this is quite the thing you're looking for, but we can tell at least how the Hebrew speakers are perceiving certain things in these other languages. And that actually tells us something about those other languages. So for example, in Egyptian, a lot of words, if we go way back, Old Kingdom, early Middle Kingdom, we see that words ended with feminine words ended in a T sound. But that changed, kind of like it would be the case in Hebrew. Originally, we had a tav that was used at the end of words, and in other Semitic languages too, like we can compare that in Akkadian and whatnot. But in Hebrew, it's changed to just an ah sound, right? The feminine ending. So it was a similar kind of thing in Egyptian, and we can actually pinpoint the origin, the time, at least when these words entered Hebrew, based on whether they preserve that final T sound or not. You know, if they do, then it means they were borrowed very early before it was lost in Egyptian. And then if they don't, if they use just a final hey to represent that ah sound, then it indicates that they were borrowed later. So it's interesting, not just what we can say linguistically, but even in terms of pinpointing the date as far as when these seem to have entered the Hebrew language.
Right. Coattailing the question, your statement about understanding when these loan words got into the Hebrew, I want to ask you about a question that I think is sometimes a center for at least a traditional debate about how could, or to what extent rather, can these loan words that we find help us determine the dating of the different texts in the books of the Hebrew Bible itself?
Mhm. That's a really good question, and just like you're saying, it's something that is definitely debated these days. And you have some people, I mean, traditionally, they've argued that you can date a text if it's Persian, it's got to be late. Whereas if it doesn't have Persian words, then maybe it's early. So there's that whole conversation. For me, based on my research, it's much more nuanced than that. We can't automatically use a word to date a text because nobody's ever forced to use a loan word. It's not like you ever have to use one. You could, in theory, use a native equivalent if there is one, or at least some other way of saying it. So you're never forced to use a loan word. You could avoid it if you wanted to. So the absence of words doesn't necessarily tell us a whole lot. The presence of words, of a loan word, can be helpful, but the thing here is that, at least for some of these languages, even Persian, obviously the contact is going to be a lot stronger during the Persian Empire, but we do have evidence that there's contact with Persians, at least casual, maybe more sporadic contact with Persians a few centuries before the time of the Persian Empire. So just because we find a Persian loanword doesn't mean that it's automatically late. We can't make those kinds of quick assumptions.
Is there any while the principle is obvious and very important, are there any practical Persian words or otherwise words that you would say, oh, scholars considered them, or many scholars considered them to be necessarily late, but I think that this is more likely to be earlier? Or is it just kind of a caveat, a general caveat on the tendency of scholars to do that?
Yeah, I'm just more offering a caveat. There are some words which would come from Persian, or even there's a Greek word, or at least what I argue is a Greek word, melet, that shows up in Jeremiah. So these are not early. These are, definitely during the, I guess we could say, the transitional time, transitional Hebrew, right, between standard and late. But the fact that we find them there is a helpful reminder, I think, that we can't assume that just because we find something, we find a Persian loanword or a Greek loanword, that it's got to be automatically late biblical Hebrew. It still could be in that transition stage, maybe even a little bit earlier in some instances.
Mm-hmm. The same is oftentimes discussed in regards to the book of Daniel, and at least traditionally with the Greek words that are found there, which are more of a cultural word or general terminology for katros or kitros, or right, guitar, okay, which we find in many languages. And the fact that we find a Greek word doesn't necessarily mean that it is written in the Hellenistic period. That's the same type of symphony as well. I see that Clark has mentioned it in the chat. So this is the type of nuanced approach towards the understanding of loanwords. Your book is not limited to the interaction between just the word, but it talks about the interaction between cultures, as you said, between people. How can the loanwords better help us understand the relationship, the historical relationship between non-Semitic people and the people who lived in ancient Israel?
So going back to at least some of what I said before, a lot of what we can learn there has to do with the types of words that are borrowed, what we would call the semantic domain. So are they related to like the economy, or are they related to administration, or maybe it's writing or warfare? What we can tell is that if a language, Hebrew, is borrowing a lot of words from a particular category, again, administrative, economic, whatever, they're borrowing a lot of words from that category from a particular language. That's where the influence was, as opposed to, they're not probably being influenced as much from a different semantic domain, a different category of loanwords. And so we can see that when it comes to the Hebrew Bible's loanwords, that there are those patterns. Like I already mentioned, how the Persian loanwords tend to, I mean, not all of them, but tend to be associated with the economy, administration. In Egyptian, we have a lot more that deal with specific like physical things, objects like gemstones, metals. There's a few terms for metals there, but also terms for writing. And so it shows that in Israel's history, we know that Egypt is influencing Israel in the arena of, say, writing, which makes sense. I mean, we knew that otherwise, in a lot of ways, we knew that there were those kinds of contacts, but this helps us to understand it that much better, and to maybe clarify our picture there, and to see, oh, okay, well, we know that this contact was there, but they're specifically related to these objects of culture.
Okay. When the innocent reader is reading his Bible, obviously in Hebrew, because that's what we do, how can they have some tools to kind of detect? How can it be a little bit more sensitive to guess, or to speculate, or to suspect when they see a word, and what should trigger their alarm and say, oh, that might not be a Semitic word, but a non-Semitic word?
Well, a good clue, and one of the best clues, and this is the way that you identify loanwords in the Bible, is just to look for words that don't look like they belong to the Hebrew language. And so we talked about, like, if there's unusual consonants in them, like the consonants just don't normally go together. If the word is really long, like a lot of the Persian loanwords in the books of Esther or Ezra.
Panim, right?
Yes.
Right. When I teach that word, I tell I tell my students, do you want to know what ha'achashdal panim is? They say yes. I say it's supercalifragilisticexpialidocious in Hebrew, right?
Right,
So,
right.
and it works every time, right?
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, those words are pretty easy to recognize because you look at it and you think, okay, this cannot be Hebrew. It's just, it doesn't have the right kinds of sounds. It's too long. It's not based on a root that you know in Hebrew, right? A lot of Hebrew nouns are based on three-letter roots. Well, if it's not based on a root, then there's the chance that it could be borrowed from some other source too.
Right. Though we have to be kind of a little bit. Sometimes it doesn't cover all the cases, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you definitely have to be careful there.
Yeah, sometimes you may have something that is innocent looking, possibly because it got around to the Hebrew through a transmitted through another language where it already kind of went through the Semitic grinder where it got a Semitic form, and then it looks Semitic enough, and you find that it is actually not a Semitic word. Okay, how about the use of loanwords? We've talked about physical objects. Okay, we don't have the word for let's say this specific gemstone, pitadao, achlama, or others. So we use the term that is used internationally, or guitar in modern Hebrew, gitara, right? We would use a term that is not originally Semitic. But you also talk about another motivation of changing of using a loan word. And again, I want to, maybe that is too complicated. Oh no, for you, you're a professor of Semitic languages, so I'll tell you, it's funny. I have a friend whose father is a judge, okay, in one of the courts in Israel. In Israeli courts, when American lawyers would use Latin to sound smart, Israeli lawyers use Aramaic. I don't know if you knew that, but they use some Aramaic phrases. However, they are not familiar with some of them, at least, are not familiar with the context, the broader context of that phrase that they're using. So he told me a story about another judge who said, we've heard one side, now let's hear the sitra achra. Right, sitra achra is a term, it's Aramaic for the other side, but it's also the term for the devil in Jewish mysticism, like the other side. And he wasn't aware of the context, and he was trying to sound smart. And you cite this, or trying to kind of use a loan word, not for practical reasons, but for other reasons. What examples can we see of that in the use of loan words in the biblical Hebrew?
So there are some examples of what we might call like style switching or code switching, where we find that loan words from a particular language are used in a setting that would make sense. So for example, in some of Isaiah's oracles against Egypt or against Cush, we see that he'll use a number of loan words that come from Egyptian. And so it's like he knows that his audience is obviously going to make this connection. Okay, Egypt, it would make sense to use Egyptian words. And so he's kind of tailoring what he's saying, even the words that he's using, based on his audience there.
Right, and this mimetic effect, like My Fair Lady, kind of portraying the Pygmalion, right? Portraying the way they speak in order to deliver part of the message, creating a connection between the form and the content, is a beautiful segue for a discussion of your latest book, which is Advances in the Study of Biblical Hebrew and Aramaic. But before we do that, is there anything else that is important about your book about non-Semitic loanwords, which I wholeheartedly recommend? It's also, as I said, it is both the lexicon and a general discussion, and I loved this combination, which enables both zooming in and zooming out on these issues. And it's guys, I sent everybody oh, I see some of, okay, I sent everybody a link to the Amazon page. Is there anything else about this book that we need to know?
No, I think just emphasizing once again that there's often, not always, but there's different usages. You can have the literary usages, which we were just talking about. There's the cultural usages. There's not always a consistent pattern. I mean, we find both, but they reveal different kinds of interactions between peoples, which, as I said, was really the thing that got me into this in the first place, that really interests me. So it's a fascinating topic.
Right. I love it, and I love the, it takes me to the modern use of language, obviously, which is also, as you said, we've talked about code switching and mimetic effects, which are a good way to address the new book, which talks about advances in the study of biblical Hebrew and Aramaic, one of which is related to that realm, or at least one of them is related to zooming out from the individual word or the individual sentence structure into other issues such as, and that's discourse analysis. And for the benefit of everybody, what is discourse analysis? Even the terminology is sometimes debated. So what is discourse analysis?
Well, it can mean a lot of different things depending on who you're talking to, but at least when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, usually what we're referring to is we're referring to the way that the language is structured and how that relates to the message that's being communicated. So is the author using like logical connectors, certain words to tell you, okay, now we're in a transition, or I'm starting a new topic. Those kinds of things, logical connectors. Also looking at the way that the verbs are used, and okay, how does that connect things together? Basically, how is the text of the Bible arranged, and how does that affect the way that people are going to understand it in terms of its meaning, its broader meaning, not just the meaning of a particular word, but words as they go together in a sentence, or even looking at sentences or paragraphs and how they relate to each other.
So in a sense, we're zooming out. When I talk about linguistics, I like to kind of do this zooming out from the individual sound or sign, which would be like phonology or morphology, orthography, and then zooming out to the morphology, zooming out to the syntax, and zooming out yet again to discourse analysis, in a sense, putting lexicography, which we've covered nicely today, a little bit aside, even though the two are connected, as we said. You've talked about code switching and the motivation that one would have to use a loan word, for instance. So what other major developments or advances are covered in the new book?
So I talk a lot about discourse analysis. Yeah, I talk about code switching. There's been a lot of discussion about verbs and things like the tense aspect mood of verbs, but also of the verbal stems, or the binyanim. There's some interesting stuff there, just as far as how we understand the function of those stems. So something like the nifal. Traditionally, people have thought that, well, they acknowledge that it's passive, that it can have a passive meaning, but they've also argued that it can be reflexive. And what's interesting is that in recent years, as we've come to understand, and this relates to the concept of voice in linguistics, like active, passive, middle, that kind of thing, as we've come to understand linguistic voice better, over the past few years, we've realized that, well, that the nifal is probably not actually reflexive in most of its instances. It's a middle stem. It expresses the middle voice. And the reason why, at least in many grammars, and I'm talking biblical Hebrew, right? They're maybe different in modern Hebrew, right? But in biblical Hebrew, at least, the reason why people have translated it reflexively, and probably incorrectly that way, is because they simply relied on translation possibilities. How can we translate this? Well, that makes sense in French or German, where we have a lot of the lexicographers of the 19th century, early 20th century. They're doing, those are their native languages. So they don't have a middle voice, or at least not an inflected form of the middle voice. And so it's not really on their radar. They're not thinking of it. But again, linguistically, we can take a look at the nifal and the way that it's used. I was just taking a look at an article that was published a year ago. I forget the author right now at the moment, but again, arguing this, that the nifal in biblical Hebrew, at least, is not reflexive, that it's primarily middle. And so that's kind of an interesting development in our understanding of it, and can help us to understand some passages that use the nifal of one root, and then a little bit later they'll use the hitpael. Those stems are not necessarily equivalent.
Very interesting. Do you have a specific example, for instance, concerning the nifal, that is oftentimes misunderstood as reflexive but should be understood as medial?
So one example I like to share with my students is found in Genesis 3. And we have an example in which the nifal is used there. And I can't remember if it's 3:8 or 3:10, but we have the nifal and then we have the hitpael, and there's this alternation there. And one of the passages that uses the hitpael is the narrator. And he says that the man and the woman hid themselves using the hitpael. That implies some kind of action on their part. The nifal is used in the other one, and that's when Adam is talking to God and saying, essentially, okay, I heard you walking in the garden, and there's debate how to translate some of these other phrases here, but I heard you walking in the garden, and I became afraid. And then he says that he hid himself, or at least that's the way that... Right, exactly. That's the way that a lot of English translations usually render this. The thing is that it's a nifal form there, and it's also different from what the narrator uses later. And so one possible understanding of the significance of that is Adam is trying to downplay his agency, his role in this. It's almost like he's saying, I became hidden, and that doesn't sound good in English, at least. But he's trying to downplay the fact that he actively hid when he heard God coming. Instead, it's, oh yeah, this just happened. Whereas the narrator tells us, well, no, he hid himself. He actively had a role in this.
Right, maybe like whenever the kids break something at home.
Right.
It broke.
Right.
It broke. I don't know. It broke. It simply broke. Okay.
Right. Or like Aaron with the golden calf, right? I just put the stuff in and poof, this came out.
Right. Right. All of a sudden. Very good. So these are all fascinating. And I want to open it a little bit for questions from the audience, guys. So don't be shy. And I already saw that Clark has mentioned the part in your book which talks about words that are incorrectly understood as non-Semitic loans. So I guess he wants to know more about that, okay. Which also I found interesting. So Clark, is that something you wanted to ask about?
Oh, it just seemed like a good question, yeah, to identify things like that. And then the other idea I had was to ask whether there's any particular set of loanwords associated with Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, both very good questions. As far as the first one goes, so what I have in my book is I actually included this in the end as an appendix, because there are a lot of ideas about loanwords out there, and people have made lots of suggestions and saying, oh, well, this word comes from this non-Semitic language. Over the course of my study, I myself concluded that at least some of these words that people had identified as being non-Semitic actually weren't. And because they're so commonly thought to be Semitic, I felt like I had to treat them. So again, I put them in an appendix, and I go through and I show how each of these are not actually non-Semitic, that they're actually Semitic. And in some cases, we can't figure out the actual origin. Like we don't have a clear Semitic root that they're based on, but maybe they're attested enough or in enough of the Semitic languages for us to identify that. Or maybe the evidence that people had, the loan word that they supposedly came from, the donor language that they supposedly came from, they had a misunderstanding of that. Some of these things may go back to, like, say, the early 1900s when, well, we didn't know some of these non-Semitic languages as well as we do now. And so it's actually based on a misunderstanding. So there's a number of words like that that people have identified as being non-Semitic. And if you look at the evidence, they're actually probably native to the Semitic languages.
Right. I loved specifically the example of the word Evion, also because of its historical context of the Ebionites and maybe related to that concept. So Evion, one of them, which is related to the root Aleph Bet Yod or Aleph Bet Hey of wanting, needing, okay, desiring. So in English, we also say want. We use the word want to suggest lacking, So in that sense, it clicked. So thank you for that. As far as the Qumran, do you have anything to say? Because it is kind of not part of the book so much, right?
Yeah, and I haven't looked at it in detail. I've looked at it some. What's interesting is that we don't, generally speaking, don't tend to find as many non-Semitic loanwords in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, there are obviously exceptions to that. I'm just talking in generalizations here, but because we do have ones like a word like Raz, mystery, or secret, right? That that basically was adopted into Hebrew Aramaic and really just became part of the vocabulary. So we have words like that really infiltrated the language probably earlier than the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls and then just stuck around in the language. So we have words like that. But otherwise, there's not, at least like I said, from my study, there's not as many non-Semitic loanwords that show up. You do have a few Greek words. You obviously have some Persian ones, but it's not the same quantity, to my knowledge, that you find in, say, the books of Ezra or Esther or even Daniel.
And definitely not as much as you would find in Rabbinic Hebrew, in the Mishnah, which is ample. The Bereshit Rabbah is ample with Greek and sometimes Latin words originally. So even if we find some, it's not to the same extent as the late biblical Hebrew or the post-biblical Rabbinic Mishnaic Hebrew that we find in the Midrashim. Guys, any other questions? You were so clear. Oh, Betsy, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for coming. I just have a question on the Greek, the Septuagint, the New Testament, the Greek. Do you see this carry forward of the Hebrew words into Greek? Why is there such a vast difference between these two languages?
So do we find words that are borrowed from, say, Hebrew or Aramaic in Greek and even in the New Testament?
Yes, exactly. And why do they seem so different? And why have we done nothing to try to bring these two together?
It's a good question. I don't know if I can say why people haven't done anything, but we certainly see those kinds of connections. And what's interesting, if you're thinking the New Testament, not even just the words that are used, but even some of the grammatical structures seem to be influenced by Hebrew Aramaic, right? And so we find those kinds of connections as well. And I know people have looked at looked at that, but there's certainly more to be done, I think, for sure. As far as words go, I'm trying to think of how many there might be offhand. It's not something I've looked at in detail.
No. And the other thing is there's very little, except for the Septuagint, I'm not talking about that. There's very little loan words of Greek in our biblical Old Testament because of the timing of it all. They weren't there yet. And so there's a big gap between these two parts of the Christian Bible because of the words. Amazing.
Yeah, it really is. And it again reflects, it's the different situations of cultural contact. You know, who are they coming into contact with? That's going to impact what kinds of words they're borrowing. And even going back to what we were just talking about, Qumran, and the kinds of words that are used there, well, think of the nature of the community. They're off there in the wilderness, in the desert, and they, at least generally speaking, are sticking to themselves. I mean, more sectarian.
They are, and they're guarding their heritage, very much so.
Exactly.
Very much
so.
so.
They're not going to allow
They
themselves.
really resented the Greek language.
Right. So they're not going to use Greek words.
No.
You know, we do have some, you know, the war scroll does show familiarity with Roman army, you know, standards and so forth. But yeah, certainly they were secluded from other Jews even, let alone foreign cultures. Yes, Georgie, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, when we discuss about the vocabulary, we take the biblical content of the Tanakh, and we even sometimes consider the rabbinic literatures. Okay, but where do apocryphal books come?
As far as the kinds of loanwords that they have in them?
Yes.
This, to be honest, is not something that I've looked at in too much detail. I've actually thought about this, though, because for me, at least, the interesting thing is, again, okay, type of literature, different time period. Do we see differences in terms of the kinds of words borrowed, the different languages that they're borrowing from? I don't think, and again, I haven't studied this in detail, but generally speaking, if you were to take a look at, say, like something which would be connected with the book of Daniel, for example, some of the apocryphal works there, there's not the same kind of presence of Persian words that we would find in the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. This is just my general sense. Again, I haven't studied this in detail, but that shows that there's at least a different setting there, perhaps, or a different community who's writing those texts, right? Perhaps.
Very interesting. That's beautiful, guys. If you want to kind of remind yourselves a little bit about these apocryphal parts within the Book of Daniel, you can go back to our discussion about the Book of Daniel with Professor Michael Siegel on my YouTube channel, which dealt with these issues. That's I think that we had a lot of intertestamental questions. So maybe you have material for your next book, you know.
Right.
Yeah, that would be.
Look at.
Yeah, guys. Any other question? Clark, is your hand up from before? Go ahead.
No, I was going to speculate based on little knowledge that perhaps one of the influences why there were fewer loanwords in Qumran is because if you're trying to be very traditional, if you're trying to make it so that you are the proper inheritors of the tradition, then you don't use foreign words. And you had mentioned that regarding the difficulty of dating poetry in the Old Testament, because people use old words to be cool, to give their works more authority and more plausibility.
Right.
So that's not a question, it's a comment.
Right. So Puritanism might be the Puritanism that was practiced by the Dead Sea Scrolls sect might be linguistically related to their choice of language. And again, that connects us to the theme that Professor Noonan suggested of how the language of the people reflects the people in a sense. And that's one of the biggest contribution of I think in a sense both books, but certainly the book about the loanwords, which focuses not just about the words, but also about focuses on the people who spoke these words and their interaction. I want to thank you wholeheartedly, Professor Noonan. It was an absolute pleasure to be here today to listen to your wise words, and had a wonderful conversation with you, everybody. And we want to give you a hand there from all over the world. You should know that people here are really from all over, I think several continents, definitely. So it was a pleasure. Is there anything you want to add as a final note?
I just want to thank you all for participating in this and for asking such great questions. This was a lot of fun for me, and as you can tell, I mean, I find this to be a really interesting topic, just loanwords, but also the Hebrew language. And so, yeah, thanks for participating. Thanks for being here, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
Hello.
And
Shalom.
and God willing, I was told that the kindergartens in Israel are gonna be starting Sunday, because we've been on lockdown for I don't know how long. And then I might have more time to read more of your excellent scholarship. And if you would be willing, we would certainly have a great pleasure of having you back to discuss in more of your scholarship. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Shalom. Shalom.
Shalom, shalom. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Shalom, Rava. Thank you so much.
Adi.
Cheers. Bye.
Shalom.